For 14 months, Maya Jenkins had existed as a ghost in Lorenzo Moretti's Chicago mansion, her dark hands polishing marble surfaces that reflected a world she could never afford to touch. In the grand limestone halls of the Gold Coast, she was a shadow in a gray cleaning uniform, an invisible presence whose life was measured by the mechanical rhythm of a cloth against mahogany. Every morning, as the biting November wind rattled the crystal windows of the estate, she wiped away dust that didn't have time to settle, her movements precise, her eyes always lowered. The scent of expensive sandalwood and aged leather, the fragrance of undisputed power, always felt like a bitter, suffocating contrast to the metallic, sterile tang of hospital corridors that had haunted her dreams for 3 long years. She had learned to predict the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Lorenzo Moretti echoing on the grand staircase, a sound that signaled her cue to vanish into the pantry or the shadows of the servants' hall, disappearing before the man who owned the very air she breathed could even realize she existed. Maya's reality was not lived in moments of joy, but in a relentless, crushing tally of scents, hours, and mounting despair. At 27, she carried the weight of an entire century on her slender shoulders, her body running on a dangerous mixture of cheap coffee and a quiet, desperate hope that was slowly running dry. She was drowning under a $118,000 medical debt, a staggering number that pulsated in her mind with every tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall. Her mother's battle with lung cancer had ended 3 years ago, leaving behind $73,000 in unpaid hospital bills, a final, cruel reminder that in America, even death has a price tag. Now, her only reason to keep her head above water was 19-year-old Andre, her brother, who sat in a wheelchair in their crumbling South Side studio, trying to navigate a world that had become too small for his brilliant mind. To the world, she was just a black girl in a cleaning uniform. To Andre, she was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. During her brief window of respite before her next grueling shift, Maya would find herself at a grease-stained diner, clutching a cup of coffee for its warmth more than its taste. It was here that she often saw Thomas, the Moretti family's longtime butler, a man who understood the quiet dignity of those who work until their hands bleed. Thomas would offer a silent nod, a rare acknowledgement of her existence in a city that preferred to look through her. He noticed her worn-out shoes and the final notice envelopes peeking from her bag, red ink glowing like a warning flare. Lorenzo Moretti, meanwhile, remained a storm that had not yet landed, a figure of dark suits and gray eyes like a Chicago winter, looking past her for 14 months as if she were made of the very glass she polished. As the chimes of the clock signaled the end of her afternoon shift, Maya felt the burning ache in her lower back and the cold weight of the bills in her pocket. She stood for a heartbeat at the servants' entrance, looking at the Chicago skyline, a shimmering tapestry of gold and steel that felt millions of miles away from her South Side reality. She was a Jenkins, and in her world, you either found a way to survive or you let the city swallow you whole. She pulled her thin gray coat tighter against the freezing rain, her head down, her mind blank with exhaustion, unaware that in the darkness of the alley 4 blocks away, the predators were already waiting. The alley was a narrow throat of brick and shadow, a place where the city's glittering Gold Coast lights didn't dare to reach. Maya Jenkins walked with her head down, her thin shoes splashing through puddles of icy water that soaked through her socks within seconds. The Chicago rain was turning into a biting sleet, the kind that cut through fabric and chilled the bone, but Maya was too exhausted to feel the cold. Her mind was a dull hum of numbers, rent, electricity, and the never-ending interest on the $118,000 debt that felt like a physical weight on her chest. She had walked this route hundreds of times, a mechanical path from the Moretti mansion to the subway station, believing that the invisible walls of Lorenzo's territory would keep her safe. The Moretti crest on Maya's gray polo, meant to symbolize a stable job, suddenly became a target for a deep-seated hatred she didn't deserve. 2 figures stepped out from the darkness between 2 shuttered storefronts, blocking the sidewalk ahead. One was broad-shouldered with a shaved head, a black snake tattoo coiling around his wrist, a mark of Clove's ruthless gang. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" the man sneered, his thick accent cutting through the sound of the rain like a rusted blade. Maya stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held out her bag and phone, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take it. Just let me pass." But they didn't want her meager belongings. They wanted to satisfy a hunger for cruelty that targeted her race and her employer. The man with the tattoo stepped closer, his eyes landing on the logo on her chest. "You work for the Italian," he spat, his bared teeth glinting in the amber security light. "Clav will like this. A gift for the man who thinks he owns Chicago." The first punch came from nowhere, catching her across the cheekbone with a force that sent white-hot pain exploding behind her eyes. Maya staggered, her world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and red. Hands grabbed her arms, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, clamping over her mouth to stifle the screams she tried to unleash. A heavy blow to her ribs left Maya breathless, the air stolen from her lungs as she collapsed onto the wet pavement. In her mind, through the haze of agony, there was only one thought: Noah. Her brother was waiting in their Southside studio, his dinner cold, his eyes fixed on the door. If she died here in the dirt, he would have no one. Someone grabbed her hair, yanking her head back toward the freezing rain, and she saw the fist coming one last time before the darkness reclaimed her. As silence reclaimed the alley, the distant roar of a black sedan approached, its headlights sweeping over her motionless form like the eyes of a predator or perhaps a savior. "Who the F***ck hit you?" The question wasn't shouted. It was a low, lethal rumble that seemed to vibrate through the silk-lined walls of the Moretti guest suite, chilling the air more than the Chicago winter outside. Lorenzo Moretti stood at the foot of the sprawling king-sized bed, his storm-gray eyes no longer looking through Maya Jenkins, but at her, really seeing her for the first time in 14 months of silent service. He saw the grotesquely swollen ridge of her cheekbone where the first blow had landed, the jagged split in her lip that had stained her simple gray cleaning polo with a dark, drying crimson, and the way her dark skin looked tragically ashen against the 400 thread-count Italian linens. The man who had spent a lifetime hardening his heart felt a strange, ancient fury flickering in his chest, an anger that went beyond mere territorial disrespect. It was the realization that a woman who had been a ghost in his house was, in fact, a person of immense, quiet dignity now shattered on his bed. Maya blinked slowly, the warm radiance of the crystal chandelier above her blurring into a kaleidoscope of gold and white through a haze of concussive pain. Everything felt surreal. The ivory-carved moldings of the ceiling, the heavy velvet curtains in deep midnight blue, and the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and old books that clung to the air. This room alone cost more than she would earn in 5 years of backbreaking labor, and yet here she was, broken and bleeding in the center of it. As she tried to shift her weight, a sharp, white-hot agony ripped through her fractured ribs, forcing a jagged gasp from her throat that ended in a weak cough. Instantly, a hand unexpectedly large, steady, and warm settled firmly on her shoulder, anchoring her to the mattress. "Do not move," Lorenzo commanded, his voice losing its edge of ice just enough to sound like a plea, though the steel remained underneath. At the bedside, Dr. Chen moved with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a man who had seen too many wounds in the dark of night. His gold-rimmed glasses caught the light as he checked her vitals, his voice a calm murmur as he listed the damage: 2 cracked ribs, a moderate concussion, and deep tissue bruising that would take weeks to fade. But Maya wasn't listening to the medical jargon. Her gaze was locked on the man in the shadows. Lorenzo had discarded his jacket, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms like corded steel and a faint, jagged scar along his jaw that seemed to pulse in the dim light. He watched her not with the cold pity of a superior, but with a terrifyingly focused respect, as if he were reading the story of her entire life: the 3 jobs, the sleepless nights, the unpaid bills, just by looking at the bruises on her face. "I have to go," Maya whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Andre, my brother, he's alone in Southside. He doesn't know where I am." She fought the heavy pull of the painkillers, her fierce pride refusing to let her succumb to the luxury that felt like a trap. Lorenzo stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the bed until it covered her completely, a dark monolith protecting her from the rest of the world. "Andre is being brought here as we speak," he said, and for the first time, Maya heard the absolute finality of his protection. When he asked her to describe the men, she forced her mind back to the alley, the smell of wet brick, the rain, and the black snake tattoo coiling around the attacker's wrist. She told him how they had laughed, how they had used her race as a punchline and the Moretti name as a target. She watched Lorenzo's jaw clench until the muscles stood out in sharp relief, his eyes turning into shards of flint. "Sleep now, Maya," he whispered, leaning down just enough for her to catch the scent of cedar and tobacco on his skin. "The men who did this think they were sending a message to me. By dawn, they will realize that the only message they sent was their own death warrant. In this city, what is mine is never to be touched." The mahogany doors of the Moretti guest suite opened not to a servant, but to a young man whose eyes held the same fierce resilience as Maya's, despite the wheelchair he sat in. Maya struggled to sit up, her breath catching as she saw Andre rolling into the room, his brown curls a tangled mess and his face pale with a worry that had clearly kept him awake for days. For a moment, the silence in the room was heavy, filled only with the soft whir of the wheelchair's wheels against the thick Persian rug. Then the dam broke. Andre reached the side of the bed and grabbed Maya's hand, his voice cracking as he whispered her name, and for the first time since the attack, Maya let the tears fall freely. She cried for the pain in her ribs, for the fear that had almost swallowed her in that dark alley, and for the overwhelming relief of seeing her brother safe within these fortified walls. Lorenzo's promise to take care of his own was no longer just a phrase. It was a black SUV pulling up to the south side to rescue a boy named Andre. Standing in the shadows of the doorway, Lorenzo watched the siblings in silence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharper than ever. He saw the way Maya squeezed Andre's hand, lying to him with a steady voice about just some street thieves to protect his spirit, even though her body was a map of bruises. Lorenzo understood then, more than he ever had, why this woman worked 3 jobs and slept only 4 hours a night. She wasn't living for herself, but for the boy who looked at her as if she were his entire world. He turned to Lucia and quietly ordered a room to be prepared for Andre on the same floor, and he summoned the family's private physical therapist to begin an assessment that the siblings could never have dreamed of affording. The afternoon sun flooded the library as the specialist, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands, began working with Andre. Maya watched from the hallway, leaning against the cold stone wall for support, her heart swelling as she heard the therapist mention that with consistent, professional care, Andre might actually regain some mobility. It was a spark of hope she had tried to keep alive with YouTube videos and cheap equipment, but here, under Lorenzo's protection, that spark was turning into a flame. Yet, the weight of this sudden generosity pressed against her chest like a new kind of debt. She sought Lorenzo out in his study, her voice trembling but firm as she told him she could not accept such charity, the food, the medicine, the specialist, because she had no way to ever pay him back. Lorenzo didn't look up from his desk at first, the smoke from his cigar curling into the air like a silver ghost. When he finally rose and stepped toward her, he seemed to tower over the room, his presence commandingly solid. He told her that she thought this was charity, but in his world, it was responsibility. He explained that she had been targeted because she wore his family's logo, because she was one of his, and in the code he lived by, he had failed to protect her. He spoke of honor and a burden that she hadn't asked for but he was obligated to carry. As he stood inches away, Maya saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability that didn't belong to a mafia boss, but to a man who had finally found something worth protecting more than power or territory. In the dark, ruthless underworld of Chicago, territory was synonymous with blood. But as Lorenzo Moretti stared at the grainy photograph held in his trembling hand, he realized that his vast empire was nothing but cold, meaningless stone. The picture, captured through a professional telephoto lens, showed Maya Jenkins smiling gently in his garden, a rare moment of peace that had now been turned into a target. The black snake tattoo he had seen in the alley was no longer just a bruise on Maya's ribs. It was a symbol of the looming war that Lorenzo had to end, not with the roar of gunfire this time, but with a sacrifice that would send shockwaves through the entire city. The meeting took place on a fog-covered pier on Lake Michigan at midnight, the air thick with the scent of salt and the distant rhythmic crash of freezing waves against the iron pilings. Lorenzo stood alone at the edge of the pier, his black wool coat absorbing the dim light of the city's distant skyline, while Claude approached with a sneer that didn't reach his cold, greedy eyes. Claude demanded the Brooklyn ports, the very jewel of the Moretti Empire, and its most profitable territory, in exchange for forgetting the black cleaning woman who had seen far too much. Without a heartbeat of hesitation, Lorenzo pulled the signed documents from his pocket and tossed them onto the wetwood between them, choosing the safety of a woman the world considered invisible over the power the world craved. Claude let out a harsh, mocking laugh as his men scrambled to grab the papers, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're surrendering a fortune for a cleaning girl, Moretti? You've gone soft," he spat, looking at Lorenzo as if he were a broken man. But Lorenzo's eyes were like shards of flint as he stepped closer, his voice a low, lethal whisper that cut through the sound of the churning water. "You see a girl. I see the only person in this city who hasn't betrayed me for a price," he said, each word falling with the weight of a final judgment. He warned Claude that if Maya's name ever touched another man's lips, there would be no more negotiations, only the silence of a grave. Lorenzo returned to the mansion at 4 a.m., the engine of his black sedan humming quietly as he crunched over the gravel of the front drive. He didn't head to his office to pour a whiskey or celebrate the peace. Instead, he climbed the grand staircase to find Maya waiting on the second-floor landing, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't hide. His clothes smelled of the midnight rain and the bitter tang of gunpowder from a world he was trying to keep away from her, but his gaze was fixed solely on her face. Without a word, he handed her a leather folder, a document that represented not just her freedom from the shadows of Claude, but the deed to a new life where she would never have to be invisible again. The Chicago skyline began to glow with the soft pinks and oranges of a December morning, the rising sun reflecting off the frosted window of a medical portal that now showed a balance of exactly 0. Maya Jenkins sat on the edge of the guest bed, her breath hitching as she refreshed the page for the 10th time, unable to believe that the $118,000 ghost which had haunted her every waking hour for years was finally gone. The heavy, suffocating weight of interest rates and final notices had been exorcised not by luck or a winning lottery ticket, but by the silent, profound act of a man who had found his own redemption in her resilience. Maya felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, a freedom so unfamiliar that it brought fresh tears to her eyes, tears that no longer tasted of salt and exhaustion, but of pure, unadulterated hope. Maya found Lorenzo on the rooftop terrace, a space she had once polished but never truly stood upon to admire the view. The first snow of the season was falling gently, tiny white flakes vanishing against his dark wool coat as he looked out over the city he had spent 12 years ruling with a fist of iron. She approached him, her voice trembling with emotion as she tried to find the words to thank him for the medical portal, for Andre's new life, and for the debt he had wiped clean without a word. But Lorenzo only turned to her with a peaceful, unguarded expression she had never seen before, telling her that she had already paid her debt with her silent kindness during those 14 months of invisible service. He admitted that while he had given her money and safety, she had given him something far more valuable: complete acceptance without judgment or condition. From the doorway below, the sound of Andre's laughter drifted up, a bright and vibrant melody that signaled he was already immersed in the law books Lorenzo had provided for his future studies. Lorenzo took Maya's hand, his thumb tracing the skin that was now healed and warm, and he confessed that since she had arrived, he no longer saw an empire to rule, but a world he simply wanted to keep safe because she was in it. They stood together as the sun fully broke over Lake Michigan, bathing the Gold Coast in a warm, amber light that blurred the lines between the Mafia Boss and the woman the world had tried to ignore. Maya realized that they were both survivors of different storms, two souls who had finally found home not in a building, but in each other's presence. As the city below began to wake, Maya leaned her head against Lorenzo's chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a man who had burned his own crown to keep her warm. The lesson was clear to her now more than ever. When we strip away the judgments of the world and the labels of race or status, we find that the most beautiful souls are often hidden in the most humble places. She knew her life would never be normal, that she would always live in a world of shadows, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. For as long as they stood together, she knew that a simple act of unconditional kindness could ignite a light strong enough to guide them through any tunnel, no matter how long or cold. The story of Maya Jenkins and Lorenzo Moretti serves as a poignant reminder that human value is never defined by the weight of one's debt or the color of one's skin, but by the quiet resilience of the soul. When we choose to look past our deep-seated prejudices and extend a hand of unconditional kindness, We do not just save others, we find the missing pieces of our own humanity. Like a steady lamp in a cold Chicago winter, a single act of selfless grace can light the way through the darkest tunnels of life, proving that mercy is the only language that can truly bridge the divide between two different worlds. As you move forward today, take a moment to cherish the quiet gifts of compassion around you, and remember that even the smallest spark of love has the power to burn down an empire of shadows. If this story touched your heart, consider passing that warmth along to someone in need, for kindness has a beautiful way of finding its way back home.